My fiancé told me, "Prenups are insults. I'd leave if you mentioned that again." I said, "Fair." Then I mentioned it again in court during the breakup settlement. I, 32M, thought I had found the perfect woman. My fiancé was everything I dreamed of: intelligent, beautiful, ambitious, and seemingly devoted to our future together. We'd been engaged for 8 months, and the wedding was just 3 months away when everything unraveled in the most spectacular fashion. It started with what I thought was a reasonable conversation about protecting our assets. I'd built my software consulting business from nothing over the past 6 years, and it was finally generating serious money. My accountant had suggested discussing a prenup, especially since my fiancé worked in marketing and made significantly less than I did. I figured it was just smart planning. When I brought it up over dinner at our favorite restaurant, her reaction was immediate and explosive. She told me prenups were insulting and showed I didn't trust her or believe in our marriage. She said if I ever mentioned it again, she'd leave me on the spot. The conversation escalated quickly, with her accusing me of treating her like a gold digger and me trying to explain it was just financial protection for both of us. She stormed out, leaving me sitting there with 2 untouched plates of food. The next morning, she apologized and said she'd overreacted. She explained that her parents had a bitter divorce when she was young, and prenups reminded her of how her father had tried to leave her mother with nothing. I understood her perspective and decided to drop the subject entirely. After all, I loved her, and maybe I was being overly cautious. But something felt different after that night. She became more interested in my business finances, asking detailed questions about my clients and contracts. She started making comments about our money and our future investments more frequently. When I mentioned wanting to keep my business account separate from our joint household account after marriage, she became defensive and asked why I was already planning to hide money from her. 3 weeks later, I discovered something that changed everything. I'd left my laptop open while taking a shower, and when I came back, she was quickly closing browser windows. When I asked what she was doing, she said she was just checking her email on my computer because her phone was dead. But I noticed my business banking tab was still open in the background. That night, after she fell asleep, I checked my computer's browser history. She'd accessed my business accounts, my personal investment portfolio, and had even researched the estimated value of my software company. She'd been taking screenshots of my financial information and had searched for divorce lawyers in our area. The timestamps showed she'd been doing this for weeks, always when I was in the shower or sleeping. I felt sick. The woman I was planning to marry had been secretly investigating my assets and researching divorce attorneys while sleeping next to me every night. I realized her emotional reaction to the prenup wasn't about trust or past trauma. It was about protecting her ability to access my money if our marriage failed. I started my own investigation. I hired a private investigator to look into her background more thoroughly. What he found was devastating. She'd been engaged twice before, both times to men who owned successful businesses. Her first engagement ended when the man insisted on a prenup, and her second fiancé had discovered she'd been stealing from his company's petty cash account. The investigator also found evidence that she'd been meeting with a divorce attorney for consultation sessions, asking specifically about asset division in cases without prenuptial agreements. But the most shocking discovery came when the investigator followed her one afternoon when she said she was visiting her sick grandmother. Instead of going to any hospital or elderly care facility, she went to a coffee shop where she met with a man I didn't recognize. The investigator took photos of them holding hands and kissing across the table. She'd been cheating on me for at least 2 months. I knew I had to end the engagement, but I also knew I needed to protect myself legally. She'd already proven she would try to take advantage of me financially, and now I had evidence of her infidelity and deception. I consulted with my own attorney about the best way to handle the situation, especially since we'd already spent money on wedding deposits and had received expensive engagement gifts. My lawyer advised me to document everything before confronting her. I gathered all the evidence of her financial snooping, the private investigator's report, and proof of her affair. I also made sure to protect my business accounts by changing passwords and moving money to secure accounts she couldn't access. The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening. I told her I knew about her secret meetings with divorce lawyers and her affair. Her initial reaction was to deny everything, but when I showed her the photos from the investigator, she broke down and admitted to the cheating. She claimed it didn't mean anything and begged me to forgive her. What happened next revealed her true character. Instead of taking responsibility for her actions, she became angry and vindictive. She told me I'd driven her to cheat by being controlling about money. She said the meetings with divorce lawyers were just research because she was worried about my obsession with prenups. She demanded I pay her compensation for the emotional distress of the breakup and threatened to sue me for fraud, claiming I'd misled her about my intentions to marry her. That's when I realized she was still trying to manipulate me for money, even after being caught cheating. She moved out of our shared apartment that weekend, but not before demanding I cover her moving expenses and pay for the deposits we'd lose on wedding vendors. Her demands became increasingly ridiculous. She wanted me to pay for her therapy to deal with the trauma of our breakup. She claimed she deserved compensation for the time she'd invested in our relationship and the career opportunities she'd supposedly sacrificed for our future together. She even had the audacity to ask for half the value of the engagement ring, saying she'd helped pick it out. I refused all her demands, which led to her hiring an attorney and threatening to take me to court. She filed a lawsuit claiming breach of promise to marry and demanding compensation for various expenses and emotional damages. Her lawyer sent threatening letters claiming she was entitled to financial support and a portion of my assets because we'd been living together and planning a life together. That's when I played my final card. In my response to her lawsuit, I mentioned the prenuptial agreement I'd wanted to establish. Through my attorney, I argued that her own previous statements about leaving me if I mentioned a prenup again proved she never intended to marry me in good faith. I submitted evidence of her financial investigations, her meetings with divorce attorneys before our engagement ended, and proof of her infidelity. The irony was perfect. She'd told me she'd leave if I ever mentioned a prenup again, and I was mentioning it again in court documents that completely destroyed her case for any financial compensation. Her own words about prenups being relationship deal breakers became evidence that she'd been planning our breakup while trying to position herself for maximum financial gain. Her attorney quickly realized their case was hopeless once they saw all the evidence I'd gathered. The photos of her affair, combined with proof that she'd been researching divorce attorneys while we were engaged, painted a clear picture of someone who'd been planning to profit from a failed marriage. The case was settled out of court with her receiving absolutely nothing. In fact, she ended up owing me money for the legal fees and had to return the engagement ring and several expensive gifts I'd given her during our relationship. The settlement agreement also included a non-disclosure clause preventing her from discussing our relationship publicly or trying to damage my business reputation. Update 1. 3 months after the settlement, I heard through mutual friends that she'd moved in with the man she'd been having an affair with. Apparently, he was a successful real estate developer, and she was already pushing for an engagement. Our friends told me she was telling people that I'd been financially abusive and controlling, which is why she'd been forced to seek legal advice during our relationship. I wasn't surprised by her attempts to rewrite history, but I was glad I'd insisted on that non-disclosure agreement. When one of our mutual friends asked me directly about her claims, I simply said I couldn't discuss the details of our relationship due to legal agreements, but that anyone who knew me well could judge my character for themselves. The most satisfying part was learning that her new boyfriend had apparently insisted on a prenup before proposing. According to our friends, she'd agreed immediately, claiming she'd learned the importance of protecting both partners' assets from her previous relationship. The hypocrisy was staggering, but not unexpected. Update 2. 6 months later, I received a call from an unknown number that turned out to be her new boyfriend. He'd somehow found my contact information and wanted to ask me about my experience with her. Apparently, she'd told him a completely different story about our breakup, claiming I'd cheated on her and stolen money from her personal accounts. He'd started to have doubts about her honesty when he caught her going through his financial documents while he was sleeping. Sound familiar? When he confronted her about it, she'd used the same excuse about just checking her email, but he'd found evidence of her researching his business assets and investment accounts. I told him I couldn't discuss specific details due to legal agreements, but I suggested he might want to conduct his own investigation if he had concerns about her behavior. I also recommended he speak with a lawyer about protecting his assets, regardless of any prenup he might have already signed. 2 weeks later, I heard she'd been dumped again. Apparently, her new boyfriend had hired a private investigator who'd discovered she'd been stealing small amounts of cash from his business and had been meeting with yet another divorce attorney. The pattern was becoming clear. She was a serial financial predator who targeted successful men and tried to position herself for maximum profit when relationships ended. Update 3. A year after our breakup, I'm in a much better place. I learned valuable lessons about protecting myself and recognizing red flags in relationships. I'm now dating someone who actually suggested we both get prenups if we ever decide to marry, which tells me everything I need to know about her character and intentions. I also discovered that my ex-fiancée had attempted to start her own business using the financial information she'd stolen from me during our relationship. She'd tried to poach several of my clients by claiming she'd been the real brains behind my business operations. Fortunately, my clients knew me well enough to see through her lies, and her attempted business venture failed within 6 months. The most interesting development was learning that she'd been featured in a local newspaper article about female entrepreneurs overcoming adversity. In the article, she claimed to be a victim of financial abuse who'd built her business empire after escaping a controlling relationship. She never mentioned the cheating, the theft, or the multiple lawsuits she'd filed against former partners. I thought about contacting the newspaper to set the record straight, but my attorney advised against it. The non-disclosure agreement worked both ways, and breaking it could expose me to legal liability. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my reputation and growing my business. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone's own behavior destroy their credibility. My ex-fiancée's pattern of targeting successful men, stealing financial information, and filing frivolous lawsuits was eventually going to catch up with her. I didn't need to do anything except protect myself and wait for her to sabotage her own life. Today, I'm grateful for that seemingly innocent suggestion from my accountant about getting a prenup. If I hadn't brought up that topic, I might never have discovered my ex-fiancée's true nature until after we were married. Her explosive reaction to the idea of financial protection was actually the first clue that she was planning to exploit our relationship for monetary gain. The irony of mentioning the prenup again in court during our breakup settlement still makes me smile. She'd warned me she'd leave if I ever brought it up again, and technically, she was right. She did leave, with nothing except legal fees and a damaged reputation. Meanwhile, I kept everything I'd worked to build and learned valuable lessons about recognizing and protecting myself from financial predators. Sometimes the best way to deal with someone who tries to manipulate and exploit you is to give them exactly what they ask for, just not in the way they expected.